Thank you, everybody, for coming to our Constitution Day event. My name is John McCarthy. I'm a professor of history here at Robert Morris University, and I also help run our Oral History Center. The Oral History Center is one of the sponsors for today's event. And I just wanted to get a quick plug-in for a project that we have been working on for a number of years now. It's the Iraq-Afghanistan Veterans Project. We are collecting hoping to collect 100 oral interviews of veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the global war on terror. We have conducted about 45 to 50 so far, and we've interviewed politicians such as Rick Saccone and Guy Reschenthaler, the president of Robert Morris University. Dr. Chris Howard is an Air Force veteran. The Steelers' starting left tackle, Alejandro Villanueva, was kind enough to interview with us a couple of years ago, and we're always looking for more people who are interested in sharing their stories with us. So if you are a veteran or if you know of anybody who is interested in sharing their stories, please contact us, and we're excited to be able to turn those into real primary sources in history. I'm now going to introduce our provost, Dr. Dave Jamison, who is going to lead our event today, and he's going to introduce our distinguished speaker. And before I do, I want to thank Dr. Jamison also for being a real major ally to liberal arts at Robert Morris University. This school started off as a business school, but we have really expanded our offerings over the last couple of decades, where now we have a history major, we have political science, we have sociology, and those sorts of majors really add to the cultural life of campus. Dr. Jamison teaches in our school. He teaches a class on the Constitution. He has a background in history, so he's definitely near and dear to our hearts. So I also wanted to thank Dr. Jamison for his support in our school over the years, too. So, Dr. Dave Jamison.
Never know where you can go with an undergraduate major in history, right? Some good stuff. I'm also honored to teach as an adjunct faculty member at Duquesne Law School with Professor Ledewitz. Well, welcome all of you to this year's celebration of Constitution Day and Citizenship Day. It's really marking both of those today, Constitution Day and Citizenship Day at RMU. I want to acknowledge and thank Donna Anderson, many of you saw when you came in, for her work in organizing the event. She's right over here from the Office of Engaged Learning. Robert Morris believes very strongly in students being engaged in their own education, and programs like this are part of the ways we provide that opportunity for students. I want to thank Dr. Kathy Denick-Brecht, Department Head of Social Sciences, and Dean Phil Harrell from the School of Education and Social Sciences. A lot of people worked to put together today's celebration. Constitution Day and Citizenship Day is observed every year on September 17th, commemorating the signing of the Constitution on September 17, 1787. 231 years ago today. It recognizes all who by coming of age or by naturalization have become citizens. This year we're very pleased to have Professor Bruce Ledewitz as our speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. Professor Ledewitz is a professor of law at Duquesne University School of Law, teaching in the areas of state and federal constitutional law and jurisprudence. He's the author of 3 books, American Religious Democracy, Hallowed Secularism, and Church, State, and the Crisis in American Secularism. Professor Ledewitz has won numerous awards for his service, his scholarship, and his teaching. He is truly a leading professor at the law school. America's constitutional project requires critical institutions like the courts, the press, and universities to pay attention to adhering to political norms. Professor Ledewitz will speak today about ways in which we can reintroduce the concept of truth and justice in politics to a skeptical and relativistic age while opposing political abuses. He recently put his money where his mouth is, purchasing this giant roadside billboard on I-86 near Erie, saying tax cuts threaten Social Security. And he'll comment on that. Greets westbound riders on Interstate 76. His wife Pat is with us today. She was the photographer of this event, so thank you for being here as well. So we're delighted and honored at Robert Morris University to welcome as our special guest and our distinguished guest speaker on Constitution Day 2018, Professor Bruce Ledewitz.
Thank you, Dr. Jamison. I also would like to thank Dean Harold for this invitation and RMU for the opportunity. It's a somber day outside. That's appropriate for Constitution Day 2018. This year, Constitution Day falls during the days of awe, the 10 days of repentance for the traditional Jewish believer that fall between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Given the current emergency in American public life, we must treat Constitution Day as a secular Yom Kippur, in which we reflect on our sins against constitutional democracy and repent. In that spirit, I would like you to entertain the possibility in a serious way that our democratic life could end. I don't mean we become less democratic. I mean something very simple, that America might no longer hold elections, whether by military coup or a civilian-imposed state of emergency. Could that happen here? Surely no American would support ending or even suspending elections. That is why it was so shocking that a poll a year ago found that 52% of Republican-affiliated Americans would support postponing the 2020 election if President Trump said that was needed to prevent illegal voting. And this is not true just of Republicans. Even before President Trump's election, there were questions about support for democracy and free expression generally in America, especially among the young. In the prescient words of Yasha Monk, published before the 2016 presidential election, quote, "The American public has never been as skeptical of democracy or as open to authoritarian alternatives like military rule as it is right now." There is a recently published book, How Democracies Die, that helps us understand how we have gotten to this point. The authors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, contrast the decline of democratic norms in America over the past 45 years with countries in which similar experiences actually led to dictatorial rule. The fundamental change that explains the end of democratic systems is the decline of tolerance for rule by the other side and the resulting end of forbearance against using all legal means to prevent that outcome. When political competition becomes unremitting warfare, democracy will come to an end. Who can doubt that this describes America today? Levitsky and Ziblatt demonstrate the various ways that American politicians do everything they can to stymie effective government by the other side and to entrench their rule when they are in office. Some would say that the Republicans started us down this road, but it is irrelevant who started it. If the Democrats retake the House of Representatives in the 2018 congressional election in a few weeks, they will probably impeach President Trump, however much or little actual evidence there is of his wrongdoing. If Democrats retake the Senate, they will block any Trump administration Supreme Court nominees from confirmation. These actions would be clear violations of the norms of tolerance and forbearance. That is where we are now. Given this emergency, we should all be concentrating intensely on how to step back from the precipice. One way that the Duquesne University School of Law is attempting to step back is assisting me in the Truth, Justice, Democracy initiative that I will describe later in this talk. Serious action and serious thinking are needed now. The hour is late. I hope it is not too late. Let me set the stage of the crisis by briefly describing the decline of the norms of tolerance and forbearance. After that, I will give you my two nightmare scenarios in which American democracy actually breaks down. As recently as the presidency of Ronald Reagan, substantial numbers of Democrats in Congress voted for much of that Republican president's agenda, including his tax cuts. That kind of bipartisanship was behind all the important policy initiatives in the 20th century. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, and on and on. Obviously, something has changed. The Affordable Care Act passed Congress without a single Republican vote. The recent Republican tax cut passed without a single Democratic vote. The current political attitude is that the most important thing for each party is that any president from the other party be brought to failure. The Republicans began to manifest this attitude during the presidency of Bill Clinton, when Clinton's first budget passed without a single Republican vote in Congress. This Republican attitude was perfectly symbolized by Mitch McConnell's comment in 2010 that, quote, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." But McConnell at least held out the possibility of cooperation with President Obama, even if he regarded such cooperation as unlikely. The Democrats, in their turn, have now perfected this partisan attitude with regard to President Trump. It makes no difference to the Democrats that there has actually been no evidence of collusion between the president and the Russians before the 2016 election. We can follow a timeline of the arrival of this hyper-partisanship. Levitsky and Ziblatt bookend two events: the failure of the Senate to consider the nomination of Judge Merrick Garland by President Obama to replace the late Justice Antonin Scalia in 2016 on the one hand, and the introduction by a young Newt Gingrich of a new form of partisan warfare in 1978 as the other. The two events manifesting the breakdown in the democratic norms of tolerance and forbearance. One fundamental moment in this decline, because it involved a deliberate strategy to obtain and keep power, occurred with the 2003 Texas legislature's gerrymander vote. The custom had been to redistrict only with a new census count. But the Republican majority in the Texas legislature undertook a rare mid-decade redistricting, aimed at continued Republican Party control of the House of Representatives, which succeeded. The Texas gerrymander was seen as ensuring control no matter what the national mood. The treatment of politics as warfare has only increased since then. Some on the political right called the 2016 election the Flight 93 election, in an allusion to the desperate straits of that doomed flight on 9/11 that crashed when its passengers rose up against the airplane hijackers. Here is the major article that called the Flight 93 election. 2016 is the Flight 93 election. Charge the cockpit or you die. You may die anyway. You or the leader of your party may make it into the cockpit and not know how to fly or land the plane. There are no guarantees except one. If you don't try, death is certain. To compound the metaphor, a Hillary Clinton presidency is Russian roulette with a semi-automatic. With Trump, at least, you can spin the cylinder and take your chances. And this same sense of desperation motivated religious believers who feared that a Hillary Clinton Supreme Court would allow tax exemptions to be stripped from any educational institution that refused to accept same-sex couples as married students. As for the Democrats, it was clear that Trump supporters were beyond the pale. Half of them were regarded as deplorables, in Secretary Clinton's memorable phrase. The Democrats would have been just as desperate as the Republicans during the election, except that they never expected Donald Trump to be elected president. Since Trump's election, however, the very same tone has been present on the left as on the right. The most common description of opposition to President Trump is resistance. There have been sporadic calls, even in mainstream forums, for actual violence in the streets. There were street protests the day Trump was elected, culminating in the Women's March on January 17, 2017. In a new phenomenon in 2018, members of the Trump administration and other prominent conservatives have been physically confronted in their daily activities and asked to leave private businesses. Can we imagine this unraveling going even further? Can we imagine the actual end of democracy? Let me now give you two scenarios in which democracy actually ends. In the first, Republicans manipulate the Electoral College to cement a permanent Republican presidency, regardless of the will of the people. Donald Trump lost the national popular vote by a pretty large margin, over 2.8 million votes, receiving only 46% of the vote compared to Hillary Clinton's 48% of the vote. The reason he was still elected was the Electoral College, in which he received 304 electoral votes compared to 227 for Clinton. The Electoral College outcome differed from that of the national vote because Clinton won very large margins in some of the states she carried, while narrowly losing important states in the upper Midwest. The election essentially came down to 77,744 votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Since almost all states allot their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the state's total vote, a winner-take-all system, this kind of divergence between national totals and electoral votes is easy to understand. Everyone knew going into the election that lopsided losses in big states could be offset by narrow victories elsewhere in terms of the Electoral College vote. President Trump won fair and square under those rules. But now, imagine what the reaction would have been if we changed the outcome of the 2016 election slightly. Imagine that those 77,744 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan had in fact changed from Trump to Clinton. Clinton, having won those three states, adds 46 electoral votes. Trump loses 46 votes, and Clinton narrowly wins the Electoral College. So the winner of the national vote becomes president after all. Except that in my hypothetical, she does not become president, because all three state legislatures had previously changed the method of distributing electoral votes from winner-take-all to distribution by congressional district. Instead of winning all 46 electoral votes in those states, she wins only a plurality and comes up short in the Electoral College. Now, Clinton, the winner of the national vote, who would have won the presidency even under the normal operation of the Electoral College, loses to a man who lost the national vote, whose party gained the Electoral College to ensure the election of a Republican president. If that would not be the end of democratic legitimacy in America, I don't know what the end would look like. This is not a fantasy. Republican legislators in those three states actually did consider making the change to congressional district distribution of electoral votes prior to the 2016 election. In all three states, Republicans at the time controlled both houses of the legislature and the governorship. In fact, 5 states that often vote Democratic in national elections, including, in addition to those 3, Virginia and Ohio, considered making this change. A move toward congressional district electoral vote selection is just a Republican Party plot to ensure permanent Republican rule of the presidency. One can see this because in late 2011, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, called by Salon magazine the GOP's corporate front group, endorsed allocation of electoral votes based on congressional district rather than by the winner-take-all method. This change would greatly favor Republican presidential candidates. But the cynicism in this conspiracy is actually much worse than that. Because in actual political reality, there has been zero movement by Republican legislators in predictably Republican-leaning states to make this change to congressional district distribution of electoral votes. In other words, what's really going on is that Texas and Florida will remain winner-take-all, while 5 states the Democrats usually win will be encouraged to move to congressional district selection. This is a conspiracy to subvert democracy. ALEC and the Republicans may claim that this is not their fault because each state makes this decision independently, but no effort was made to limit the partisan impact by, for example, including a stipulation that no state would make the change unless they all did. All this activity was behind the scenes and involved the kind of legislative backroom maneuvering that ordinary Americans cannot be expected to follow. It would not have become clear that the Republicans had stolen the presidency until the next presidential election was won by a Republican who loses the national vote, and the one after that, and the one after that, and on and on. Eventually, many Americans would have concluded that we don't have a democracy after all, and would have condoned, if not supported, the end of elections as at least more candid. Now, this nightmare scenario did not happen. Political fortune shifted. A Democratic governor was elected in Virginia in 2014, for example, and honorable Republican politicians refused to manipulate the Electoral College. The rumor in Pennsylvania was that Republican Governor Tom Corbett put a stop to all such efforts in Pennsylvania. And I'm sure there were other unsung patriots who did the same elsewhere. But this nightmare scenario almost happened. Many ordinary Republican politicians participated in this effort, heedless of its meaning for American democracy. In the words of Levitsky and Ziblatt's book, this is how democracies die. But it didn't happen. Unfortunately, my second nightmare scenario, which is just as potentially dangerous to democracy as is the first, may well happen. In this scenario, it is the Democrats, not the Republicans, who undermine, perhaps fatally, American democracy. The background for the second scenario is that the Republican Party has engineered an ideological takeover of the U.S. Supreme Court by means of 2 strategies. First was the likely refusal of the Republican-controlled Senate to confirm any nominee of any Democratic president, not just Judge Garland. It became clear from hints during the 2016 election campaign that no Supreme Court nominee of a President Hillary Clinton was going to be confirmed by a Republican Senate. In the words of one Republican strategist, the Supreme Court would just be allowed to shrink. Republicans might deny this now, but that is what was going to happen if Clinton had been elected president. The second factor is coordination between the Trump administration and ideologically committed organizations in the selection of Supreme Court nominees. Apparently, all of President Trump's potential Supreme Court nominees have been vetted and approved by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. The point of this organized coordination, which is not in any sense illegal or undemocratic, is to prevent the nomination of another Justice David Souter, a presumed conservative Republican who ends up voting with liberals on the court. Therefore, with the addition of a Justice Brett Kavanaugh to 4 already reliably conservative votes, Republicans have assured conservative control of the Supreme Court for the foreseeable future. And that future can be expected to last a long time. Not only did conservative groups that prepared President Trump's lists try to ensure ideological consistency, they tried to ensure a long tenure by designating relatively young potential nominees. Thus, Justice Gorsuch is 50 years old and Judge Kavanaugh is 53. You would expect them to serve at least 20 to 25 years on the court. But what makes Republicans think that this Supreme Court control is written in stone? In my second nightmare scenario, the Democrats retake the Senate, either in 2018 or 2020. It is crystal clear that once installed, no Supreme Court nominee by a Republican president will be confirmed by a Democratic Senate. Democrats will invoke the sainted name of Judge Garland, who is apparently destined to become the USS Maine of judicial politics. Remember the Maine. There will be no future confirmations on the Supreme Court unless a president and a Senate majority are comprised of the same party. Obviously, that by itself is bad enough. But a Democratic majority in the Congress would then be tempted to pack the Supreme Court because the number 9 for justices on the Supreme Court is simply controlled by statute. It's not in the Constitution. There is nothing to prevent expanding that number except a presidential veto. Eventually, the Democrats will control both Congress and the presidency. If they then expand the number of justices, their justification will be both that the Republicans achieved their majority on the court by unfair means, which is perhaps partly true, and that the Republicans had been prepared to let the court shrink, so why not expand it? Readers must remember that it was only the kind of informal democratic norms underlying unwritten rules that Levitsky and Ziblatt celebrate that kept President Roosevelt from packing the court in the original court packing plan of 1937. FDR had large majorities in both houses of Congress. It was the Democratic Party and its opposition that killed FDR's plan. Those kinds of informal norms, however, no longer carry prohibitive weight. It is the same as the norms that underlie not redistricting in mid-decade or not manipulating the Electoral College for partisan purposes. Those guardrails of democracy are gone. If the Democrats really did expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court to 12, let's say, anything like a rule of law would be ended and would be understood to be ended. The Republicans, in their turn, would be sorely tempted to do the same thing when they next controlled both branches. We could end up with a court of 21 or 25. Order would not be restored until both sides agreed to end the warfare over the court by perhaps a constitutional amendment freezing the size of the court. And when would that happen? What would provoke the Democrats to proceed in such a reckless fashion? Unfortunately, the answer might well be that nothing can prevent it, no matter how restrained and reasonable the new court majority proves to be. There is a strong feeling among Democrats that the Republican majority in the Senate stole a Supreme Court seat and, quote, got away with it, thereby necessitating a response. And Democrats plainly don't understand how dangerous this would be. On Sunday, September 2nd, 2018, a New York Times editorial offhandedly mentioned this possibility of expanding the court without a hint of the damage it would do. Certainly, the same issue that provoked FDR would be enough to cause the Democrats to consider packing the court: the reach of basic federal power under the Commerce Clause and economic due process. If a new conservative majority on the Supreme Court were to hold that Congress lacked authority to regulate against climate change, for example, I believe a Democratic majority in Congress would respond. I don't expect such rulings, however. And so the second nightmare scenario also might not occur. But if worse really were to come to worse, and the Democrats really did expand the Supreme Court, the reaction from conservatives would be extreme. The rhetoric of Flight 93 would return. There would be strong feelings of persecution. There undoubtedly would be at least some instances of armed resistance. A lot of people would feel they have nothing to lose. I don't think people would wait to see what an expanded Supreme Court would actually do. I don't believe democracy would survive. Given these potential nightmare scenarios, and given the evaporation of democratic norms that makes these nightmares plausible, the question is, what must we do to save our democracy? We have to proceed on two levels. First, we must directly confront the decline in democratic norms. We each have to practice tolerance and forbearance. That does not mean being nice to our political opponents. It means accepting that your political opponents will in fact attain power from time to time and will enact policies that you find deeply offensive. We have to learn again to accept that and to fight another day. No more filibusters over Republican tax cuts, for example. In terms of the Truth, Justice, Democracy initiative I mentioned at the beginning, this is the democracy part. We have to oppose only by ordinary democratic means. I am trying to organize a bipartisan group of American law professors, a caucus, that promotes democratic values and urges the courts, especially the Supreme Court, to look more closely at voter ID laws and gerrymandering and all the other attempts by politicians to take partisan advantage outside of democratic norms. The job of this pro-democracy caucus would be to reach out to politicians and the public to protest the abuses of politics, especially by one's own party. So Republican law professors, many of whom criticize quietly the treatment of Judge Garland, should have been much louder in calling for Judge Garland's confirmation. Similarly, there was no justification for the filibuster against Judge Neil Gorsuch's nomination, and Democratic law professors should have said so. I'm sure you can recognize how hard it is to criticize your own side these days. We all feel justified. We know, or we think we know, that our opponents are unreasonable. We have to change all that. You are not law professors, except Dr. Jamison, who is. But you can also practice tolerance and forbearance by genuinely getting to understand how the world looks to the people you disagree with. I have a friend who is a committed Republican. When the presidential nominating conventions occur, he is careful to watch the Democratic convention mostly on Fox and the Republican convention mostly on MSNBC. He says this way he gets a feel for the basis of political opinions that he otherwise finds baffling. This is a small example, but a revealing one. Another decline in democratic norms that we have to confront directly is the death of truth. This is not especially a criticism of President Trump, who, by the way, is sometimes exaggerating rather than actually lying. And the lies he tells are sometimes so outlandish, claiming that his inauguration crowd was as large as those of President Barack Obama, for example, that they do not pose a threat to democracy. No, I am talking about lies concerning policies and their effects. Both parties do this, but the overall amount of lying and its acceptance have increased. So we were told by President Obama that under the Affordable Care Act, we could keep our doctors and medical plans. He may have believed that for a time, but he kept repeating it long after he knew that it was not true. The ACA might not have passed without that lie. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, the Republican tax cut, passed on the promise that tax cuts pay for themselves. Under most conditions, they don't. And this tax cut is predictably exploding the deficit. If the truth had been told that the deficit would go up substantially, but that there would be a temporary boost to the economy and jobs, maybe the tax cut would not have passed. Did the Republicans in Congress know that they were lying to us? Of course they did. This is from an article in the New York Times. Quote, Senator Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee, who considers himself a strict deficit hawk, said, I'm going to want to believe in my heart that we're going to be lessening deficits, not increasing. That is bad faith. This is the truth part of the Truth, Justice, Democracy initiative. To respond to the death of truth, I took out a billboard in Erie on I-86, which is still up today. It's coming down soon. And it says, as you can see, tax cuts threaten Social Security, and it says that I paid for it. So this is the picture right here, and then Pat took this picture under the billboard when we had a press conference. Now, the point of the billboard was not opposing tax cuts or supporting Social Security, but opposing lying. I would like to see ordinary people do something similar every time a politician lies about an important policy. Republicans and Democrats at all levels of government, thousands of billboards across the country. We can confront lying in other ways too. I would like to see every candidate running for Congress ask directly, do tax cuts pay for themselves? If the candidate answers yes, then no one should vote for that person because that is a lie. Now, if the answer is no, but you don't have to repay the deficit, or jobs gained are worth it, or whatever, that's a different matter. That's a matter for democratic debate. You can vote for someone like that. Democracy is impossible if our leaders actually lie about the effect of policies. Lying treats the American people like infants, incapable of deciding things. We are not subjects. We are citizens. And we have a responsibility to stop this practice of routine lying, and we can do it. But the question of truth that this raises forces us to dig a little deeper than we have to this point. Ledewitz and Ziblatt tell us how democracies die, but not why. Why do politicians and then whole populations cease to practice tolerance and forbearance? Once the process starts, it is hard to stop. But why does it get started in the first place? In Europe in the 1930s, decades of war and economic dislocation can be blamed. But that is not the case with regard to America from 1978 to the present. Wage stagnation is not sufficient to explain how Americans came to be so deeply distrusting of each other. Race is undoubtedly a factor, but racial antagonism is declining over time, not increasing. At a recent meeting, a potential participant in the pro-democracy caucus lamented the current unwillingness of Americans to take the long political view. A lot of the things that are bothering us have happened before. Why is it that Americans are now so on edge and so unwilling to be patient in political outcome? Pondering that question brought me back to a famous teaching by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that, quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." When you believe that, as did Dr. King, you can trust that eventually current wrongs will be righted. That may be why Dr. King could work so patiently, actually loving his opponents and hoping for their eventual conversion. This is the justice part of the Truth, Justice, Democracy Initiative. Something along the lines of Dr. King's teaching may be necessary in order for democracy to work. We must believe that our fellow citizens will have the wisdom to recognize justice and that our society will move in the direction of justice. If instead we believe that our culture is captive to the whims of modernity, which is what the right tends to believe, or is captive to the lies of dark money, which is what the left tends to believe, democracy is worthless and will eventually pass away. In other words, our nihilism may be why our democracy is threatened. We no longer believe in the power of truth. I mention this because while hard work is needed right now to shore up our tattered democratic tradition, when that work is completed, as hopefully it will be, and the emergency recedes, as hopefully it will, we must still ask, why did it almost happen here? If the answer to that is that we are experiencing a spiritual crisis, then a different kind of action is also needed to save democracy, changing not just the way we act in politics, but changing our consciousness about the universe itself. This is a large subject beyond my ability to address here in any detail, but I will say that years of academic postmodernism, years of scientific materialism, years of economic determinism, years of excessive individualism have all led us on the political right and on the political left to be skeptical about the reality, even the existence, of all the classic universals, the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just. And all of these skeptical views are ultimately how we cope with the death of God. This enormous cultural shift cannot be confronted by urging people to go back to church. I myself belong to no religious tradition, for example. But we can start by confronting what has become a mere assumption that justice and truth are not real and have no power. So with Duquesne's help, I am trying to create the Bends Toward Justice podcast series, in which I will talk to people, some leading citizens, some ordinary people, about Dr. King's teaching and what they think about it. I anticipate in these conversations an initial skepticism, but then a reappraisal as the implications of relativism and nihilism become more evident. My goal is eventually to create a large archive of these podcasts so that people can find others who are like them and hear how the conversation went. But for the moment, I am fundraising for a demonstration project on Kickstarter. I am not asking you for money. But if you want to see it, you can go on the Kickstarter site under the Ben's Toward Justice podcast series. So there you have it. The crisis, its unfolding, and what we must do about it, directly and indirectly. I told my students in the first class of constitutional law this year that the Constitution had failed. Its structure did not prevent this crisis. The framers of the Constitution would not be shocked by that. They never thought healthy politics would be automatic. They would fault us not for the crisis, but for not reacting in a responsive and responsible way. So I am charging you here today to take the crisis seriously and to respond in order to save our democracy. When asked upon leaving the original Constitutional Convention what form of government we had, Ben Franklin reportedly replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. So let's get to work trying to keep it. The hour is late, but it is not yet too late. Not yet." Thank you.